This is Research Like a Pro, episode 18, How to Make a Locality Guide. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, a Genealogist Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi everyone, welcome to Research Like a Pro. I'm Nicole Dyer, one of your hosts, and our other host is Diana Elder. How are you, Diana?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here today. I'm excited to talk about locality guides.
Yes, today we are talking about how to make a locality guide. And the reason why is because we got this great review and comment from one of our listeners. So here's the review from Debbie W. She says, I tried to submit this comment on Stitcher, but since I reviewed once before, it wouldn't let me a second time. So she ended up submitting this on our blog post as a comment. So she says, I wanted to mention how much I have enjoyed the last two podcasts on organization and productivity. Last week, I spent some time getting organized using tips I heard on the podcast. And now I feel so much more focused and clear about my work. And I'm excited to try out some of the things I learned about productivity after listening. One idea I have for a future podcast that would help me is talking a little more about the process of creating a locality guide. For me, the biggest challenge is keeping track of where I have looked because each web page I look at has links to other pages, and those pages often have links as well. So I find that I get a little overwhelmed by it and have trouble keeping track of where I went and to know if I recorded everything that would be helpful. I also have trouble knowing when I can say that I'm finished. I guess technically it is never finished, but at what point have I added enough to be able to move on to the research stage? So if you have any additional tips, I would love to hear them. Thank you for taking the time to share what you have learned. It has been very helpful. So to Debbie, thank you for giving us the idea for this episode, and thank you for the kind words. We definitely agree that creating a locality guide can feel overwhelming when you have so many things you want to add to it. And it's very common to feel like it's never finished because we can always learn more about a locality. And there are lots and lots of websites, like you mentioned, that have information that could be helpful to us that we'd want to include. So we are going to answer those questions today and talk about our experiences with making locality guides. So Diana, what do you want to start talking about first?
Well, let's start talking about just some of the basic things that we like to put in the locality guide. And for anyone listening, if you have purchased the book, Research Like a Pro, a Genealogist Guide, then you'll know that you have a template there, and it gives you several different categories and ideas of what to put in that. And I love having a template because sometimes I forget about a certain category. So for me, it's very helpful to start with a template and then start filling it in as I go. One of the things that I think is so helpful is the very first section that says, this is the background information and quick facts. And I love the quick facts section because I go to that all the time. And that's where we put in, if it's a state guide, we'd put when the state was formed, what kind of a state. Is it a federal land state or a state land state? When did they start requiring registration for births and deaths? What's the capital? And that information could also be, if it's a county guide, some quick facts about the county. So I like having that right at the top because that's the kind of stuff I refer back to all the time. And then the second thing that I refer to all the time are links to online research guides. And this would be maybe the FamilySearch Wiki for that particular state or county. It could be like all the collections on Ancestry.com for the state, or the FamilySearch Catalog section for that county. So this would just give me the jumping off point to go to those websites that are going to have a lot more information. And so I like having those right up front.
Right. I think it's good when you're doing a state guide to put those links to the record collections on Ancestry by state and whatnot. But then when you're doing a county guide, often you won't find a lot of catalog entries by county in the Ancestry catalog. So that's not as useful, but you can definitely do that for the FamilySearch catalog because they have each small locality in their catalog. And then also another one that I like in there is to put in the US GenWeb site for that county or that state. So yeah, those are some good ones. After that section, we have the geography and maps section. And this is such an important section to include because it allows you to learn about the geography and find maps that can be helpful in gazetteers. So It depends on what you prefer to do. I like to find a couple really good maps and copy and paste them right into the document. And ones that, especially that show historical counties and that kind of thing. And then, of course, I always include a link to the Map of US website where they have the historical boundary changes and those kind of things. What do you like to put in there?
Yeah, I do like to have a couple of maps copied and pasted in there, and I always do the link back and try to do a little citation. And often I use those maps in my client work, in a client project to show the client what the state looked like at this particular time. And so it saves me a lot of time having the map already and having the source citation already done up for that. So that's just a little tip that I've learned. And there's nothing more annoying than, maybe putting an image into your locality guide and then not knowing where it came from. Because if you ever have to cite it, then you have to go spend a lot of valuable time looking for it again. So I really don't recommend doing that. But I also like to do some good links to maps. And sometimes your states will have, if you're doing a state locality guide, they will have a whole database just for their state. And so I like to look for something like that and have in that section also. And gazetteers, the same thing. I like to find a couple of gazetteers always and have links to those. And I find those through FamilySearch, through the Wiki. They'll have gazetteers that are often digitized, and then I can have the link right there in my locality guide.
That's wonderful. So the next section we have in the background part of Locality Guide is the timeline of major events. When I first made a locality guide, I spent so long on this section and the next one about the history of the area because I like history and I just got really into it. But I realized I think I was probably going a little too in depth. What do you think? How deep do you go on this?
Well, to be really honest, my favorite thing to do, if I can find it, is to find a timeline that someone else has done on the area. And sometimes you get lucky. And again, you can find that on a website for a state or a county, and maybe someone has already done up a simple little timeline. And then I can use that as my jumping off point, just doing a link to that. But I really do like to simplify the timelines because I think a lot of people that publish a timeline on the internet, they do what you do, really, really in depth. And I sometimes don't need to know every single little detail. So I tend to simplify a little bit. So I will maybe do a state guide. And our states didn't all start out as states, right? They started out as colonies or they started out as territories. And so I like to start with, when do people start coming into this area? Then I like to just kind of hit the major points. Okay, so Alabama was a territory here, and then it became a state here. And then, kind of going through the major things, maybe some of the major conflicts, anything that would have a bearing on my research.
That's a good point. Anything that would have a bearing on your genealogy research, because I think it's easy to start making a timeline of all kinds of things that might not be as applicable to finding records and that kind of thing. And then I like the idea of just putting links to other people's timelines so that if you need to know more historical background for a certain project, then you'll be able to find it. But you don't have to create the timeline yourself, just putting links to different historical articles and timelines.
Right. That's really important. And if you're working in states that, I am accredited in the Gulf South. And so the states in the Gulf South went through several different hands before they became U.S. states. They were maybe governed by the French, and then they were governed by the Spanish, and then by the English, and back to the Spanish. And so I have all these different governments, actually foreign governments, that would hold the records for the area. And so I made myself very clearly, who was in charge during this time frame. And that helps me to know if I'm researching well into the 1700s in, say Alabama, that I need to be thinking about British records or Spanish records, whatever is applicable. So not all states will have that type of a thing, but take a look at the history of the area and see what's going to be the most beneficial in your research.
Right. So next in the template, we have migration routes. And usually for that, there are lists and maps in the FamilySearch Wiki for a lot of US migration routes that are helpful. And you can find links to maps there. Have you found any other good resources for those migration routes?
I have found a couple of things. Again, it depends on your locality. Just doing some Googling, I have found other websites that have information about that. So, we talk a lot about United States records, but I also want to give a shout out to anyone who's researching and England or Ireland or Germany or Canada, any other location besides United States. And so I would always say go to the FamilySearch Wiki first because it has international reach. But then you're going to have to dig deeper into some other websites to try to help you find specific migration routes and information on your particular location.
Okay, let's talk about another section in the background information, law and government. What do you put in there?
Sometimes the laws are a little bit difficult to figure out and to find. So I like to check out the book websites. So I'm looking for here those historical laws because if I am looking, say, in Georgia at a marriage in 1850, I need to know what was the legal age for a woman to be married before she had to have consent of her parents. That could have bearing on my research, right? So that's not typically, you put that question in a Google search and sometimes you might get lucky and have an answer. Somebody wrote a blog post about it, but often you can't find it. So I like to discover those old books that are like the laws and statutes of Georgia or whatever locality. And you can find those on the major book websites like Google Books, Internet Archive, Jenny and Net has some. And also, if anyone listening has not subscribed to the Legal Genealogist blog, that's a great blog post that Judy Russell writes. And she often will talk about finding these, resources for these old laws and statutes. So you can even go to her blog post, the Legal Genealogist blog, and then do a search for your locality. Sometimes that brings up a lot of hits though. So that's why I have just subscribed to it. And then whenever a blog post comes up in my email box, if it's one that pertains to one of my states, then I can just pop that into my research log or into my research locality guide. So law and government can be a little bit tricky to find.
But so helpful to help you understand those old records. I mean, I found some records about an ancestor who had been elected as a certain office and I didn't know what it was. And so I had to look it up in the Arkansas statutes and find out what it really meant. So it really helped to kind of give context to his life.
Yeah, and that's one that it's so helpful to have the links right in your guide to not have to go looking for it again because they are a little bit more difficult to locate.
All right, next we have libraries and archives. So this is an important part of the locality guide because you can list which repositories and courthouses and public libraries and so on might aid you with this locality. So I usually just go to Google and type in like Hawkins County, Tennessee Genealogy Society, Historical Society, Hawkins County Courthouse, and then I put the information into that section. So I'll put in their address, telephone number, email address, their hours, and any more information. In this last locality guide that I made for Hawkins County, they did have a list of all of the records that they hold at their archives. So I put that list there so that I could just know if I can't find this collection in the FamilySearch Catalog, then I can contact the archives and have them search it for me if possible.
Right. I think that's really helpful. And I always tell everyone that's working on the locality guide, don't just put the name of the library or the archive. Make a little note because you will never remember what you learned about it while you were doing your guide. You're looking at a website, you can see what they have. Just take a few minutes and put in your note. They have got a great collection of marriage records, or they have the deeds for everybody in the Northeast portion of the state. Whatever is kind of notable about that archive or library, that repository, give yourself that little boost of knowing right when you look at your guide what they have and what could be beneficial to your research. And I just want to give a little shout out to the book, America's Best Genealogy Resource Centers, and we have information for that in our template. But it's by William Dollarhide and Ronald Bremer, and they have taken the time to find the top 10 repositories in each state. And they have contact information and a summary of the record collections. So sometimes we just need these little shortcuts to help us. And I love using that book. Something else that we talked about a while ago, Nicole, was using the ArchiveGrid, where you can put in a location and then you can see all of the archives around that location. So we'll put a link in the show notes to the ArchiveGrid and you can explore that. And you could even maybe just have a link to that in this section to remind you to go look at it, which I don't think I've done that in my locality guides. Maybe I will go do that today because it is such a valuable resource and I forget about it.
Right. It helps you find all of those collections that are housed in genealogy societies, historical societies, local archives that we don't know about. And often those can hold the answers that we need. So it's good to expand our research beyond what's online and make sure that we're getting in touch with the local resources.
Okay, so also kind of along the lines of the libraries and archives, we have a section for genealogical societies and publications. So here, generally, you're not going to have a ton of societies for each location. You'll have maybe a county society and a state society, or maybe you'll have a regional society, but that can be very helpful to have a link to their website and to their publications. Some of the societies have started digitizing their publications from the past and have those available for free on the internet, or sometimes they ask for a small fee to purchase them. So that can be very helpful in your research to go take a look at what the societies have out there. And if you've never looked at a genealogical society publication, you never know what you're going to find. People will write articles, and you might have a list of men in the county who took the oath of allegiance after the Civil War. And maybe that's the only place that list is published. I mean, sometimes you can find real gems in those society publications. So it's worth it to have a link to it in your guide so that when you get stuck, you can go see, okay, what else can I look for? And might get the answer.
In my Hawkins County guide for my most recent locality guide, I'd put a lot of information in about the publication of the Genealogy Society because it had been going on for a while and it was good. And they had some of the issues were digitized, but all of them were indexed in the PERSI index, which is the Periodical Source Index. So it might be a good idea to include a link to PERSI in that section just to remind yourself that you can search that index to find if there's anything specific about your surname within that publication. And that is housed at Find My Past now. And I'm just looking at their website now to see how it's going. And it says they have 2.7 million entries in PERSI at Find My Past. And that's 2.7 million journal record entries from thousands of historical, genealogical, and ethnic publications. And I think they are working on getting those digitized. So I'll have to do some more research on what Find My Past role is with getting the articles digitized, or if it's just the Genealogy Society who's digitizing them themselves. Do you know?
I believe it is Find My Past, but I'm like you. It has been a while since I have researched specifically that, but it is exciting that they are hosting that index because before that, it was a little bit more difficult to find PERSI and to actually do the research using it.
Right. Oh, I scrolled down on the page, findmypast.com/PERSI, and they have a big banner to genealogy societies that says, societies, learn more about joining PERSI. Email us here. And then it talks about, if you want to get your publication digitized, then we can help you. So it sounds like they're partnering with the societies to get those digitized, which is so exciting. So if you have contact with a society that has a publication, you can encourage them to do that too.
Wow, that is amazing.
Yeah, it's exciting because those publications from a long time ago have research in them that could really help us, especially if they've been running for a long time and have the kind of sources that tend to disappear, like family Bibles and letters and those kind of things.
Right. And sometimes there are genealogies where somebody in the county has put together all the family members and that's not published anywhere else but in that little society publication.
Okay, another section that we like to include in our locality guide in the background information is about record loss. So what do you typically try to find out about record loss for that?
That's where I put when the courthouse burned, and I'm always really excited if the courthouse never burned and the records go way back. That's when I do a little silent shout hooray because a lot of my southern counties did have courthouse fire. So that's when I try to find out what records are available, what happened with the record. And sometimes on the FamilySearch Wiki or perhaps, a website for the county, they will have a little substitution for the record. So they'll say, well, the courthouse burned, but this record set includes a lot of the records that were lost. And so that can be really helpful to have in that section on record loss.
Yeah, that section is really helpful because even though I had just created my locality guide for Hawkins County the other day, when I was doing my research plan, I had forgotten, and I was looking through that, and I noticed that all of the census from 1790 to 1820 had been destroyed for Hawkins. And so it was a good reminder to me that I would need to find some record substitutes for those time periods, which is exactly the time period that I need to search for the father of my husband's ancestor. So instead, I used the tax list for 1819, and I put that in my research plan. I haven't searched it yet because I'm going to have to ask you to go look for it in the family history library. It's in a book. But that's going to be my substitute for that record loss of the censuses.
Yeah, that's a great idea to put the specific record collection that you know exists that could be the substitute.
Well, I didn't put that there. It was just later in my locality guide, but just scrolling through my locality guide as I was research planning, that's when I remembered, oh yeah, there's no censuses for that time period. And it's always maddening when you're thinking, okay, I'm going to search the 1810 census, and then you do a search and you can't find anything, and then you realize, oh, there is no census return for that year in that area.
Yes, indeed. And we run into that. I'm researching in Virginia right now, and same problem. No Virginia censuses that are extant for 1790 and 1800s. So there we go to the tax lists and church records and deeds, seeing what we can find.
Right.
So,
All right, next we have local history books and other histories. So this applies specifically to books that would be about a county or a state, or even if you're doing a town. But usually what we find are county histories. So where do you find links to those?
I like to look at the FamilySearch Wiki again, and I like to look at the county level for that. They aren't always listed on the FamilySearch Wiki, so maybe an even better place to look for those would be on the FamilySearch Catalog and to search it by your specific location, like your township or your county. And if you look under, it'll bring up a whole list of the record collections, and it will have one specifically for history. And if you click on that, it will give you all the local history books. So I think the FamilySearch Catalog in this case is probably the best place to go to look for those histories. And like we have said many times before, sometimes they are digitized and you can just read them for free online. And if they're not, then you can do interlibrary loan and see if your library will order one in from wherever it is hosted in some library clear across the country. And so there's a lot of options to getting your hands on those local history books. You can also do Google searches. That actually works really, really well for local history books. You can look at Google Books or the HathiTrust, Internet Archive, all of our book resources when we're trying to get books for family history.
There are so many ways to find those. Yeah. It's good to sometimes even just search Google if you're doing a specific county. Just say Hawkins County, Tennessee county history or local history book. Sometimes the genealogy societies will have a list of books that are about that locality. And so there's really two places you could put that in your guide, under genealogy societies and publications and under local history. And sometimes they'll just have a link to it.
Right.
So you never know. All right, reference books.
So I like to think of reference books as books that teach you about research. If you are doing Ireland, say maybe you're doing a guide for one of the jurisdictions of Ireland or one of the areas there, then perhaps under reference books, you would want to have one of John Grenham's books on researching in Ireland or another great methodology book, just to help you remember that there are other people that have written about how to research in your certain area. Because honestly, you might forget, or maybe you don't even know that there's some really excellent material out there to help you learn how to research in a locality. There are books that are written about just all the records and like the state archives that could be a good reference book. So this is just something that if you come across something, you could put it in this area. Not all locations maybe would have something. If you're like your Hawkins County, there may not be a reference book telling you how to research in that county.
But maybe there are finding aids or maybe pamphlets from the archives or the libraries there. And you could even put a note, I have this pamphlet in my files, and then you could just remember that you have it to get it out.
Yeah, we created this template just to put ideas in there. But remember, anyone who's working on a locality guide or thinking of doing it, this is for you. This is probably not anything you're going to publish or share with someone else, even though you could. But this is for you. So you could want to put in all the things that are going to help you the very most in your research.
Yeah. So from the beginning till now, we've just been talking about the background section of the locality guide template. And then the next section is all the record collections. So in the next section, we usually just put links to different record collections in different categories. So we have all these different categories. We have general collections, like the list of resources for your locality at Ancestry, FamilySearch, MyHeritage, and so on. And then we have Bible records, cemetery records, census records, church records. So what we do is we just copy and paste the links into this section so that we can see, what record sets are available. And what I like to do is put in the title of the collection and then where it is located, like at Find My Past or at the archives or whatever. And then I highlight the text of the title and then I right click on it and paste the hyperlink that way so that I don't have the long hyperlink in the text, but I have it linked to the text of the title, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I do that too because I like to have my locality guide looking pretty. I don't want to have a lot of those ugly links in there, so I do try to make it look really nice.
Well, and it helps us when we're researching to look through a nice, clean locality guide to know what we have and what we're looking for.
Right. One of the things that I really like to do when I'm creating a locality guide and I'm looking at a specific collection is to, again, make myself some notes. I like to do a little bit of research in the guide. And a lot of times, study group members or eCourse members will say, how do you keep yourself from doing research when you're finding all of these great collections? And how do you keep from going off on the bright, shiny objects? And I just say, one of the things I like to do is just put in the surname of Smith, because every record collection will come up with some hits for Smith. And then you can just look and see what the records are about. What do the records actually look like? What does the birth certificate in that area look like? What information is in the marriage bond? So if you can use a surname other than your own, then you won't get so intrigued and get so sidetracked, but you can still look at records and make yourself a note and say, yeah, this should list the parents, or this does not give any information whatsoever on collateral members of the family, what have you. But I like to do a little note because, again, I will not remember that collection very well unless it's one that I use all the time, like the census. But a lot of these records are a little bit different. And so it's really helpful to know what might be in that collection.
Yeah, and sometimes I have to create a new category for record types in the record collections section because some locations had different type of records that were kept. Like Virginia, they have a whole bunch of legislative records. So I added a lot more to that section than other localities. And then military records, just depending on how old that area is, they could have colonial military records, militia records, and then some of the newer counties and areas will only have records from World War I and forward. So you never know what you're going to have. Let's talk about the newspaper section of the records because there are a lot of ideas for how to add newspapers to your locality guide that are more helpful. So the first time I made a locality guide, I just put in the names of the titles. And then you gave me the idea that I should put in the years that the newspaper was published, because if you don't know when it was published, it's not very helpful. So now I go through the entire Chronicling America newspaper directory for that locality. And so I just did this for Hawkins County. And I found all of the newspapers that were specific within that county. And there was really only one city that published a newspaper. And you'll find that newspapers are published by city. So you have to kind of look at what cities are closest to your county and then focus on those, because even cities that are outside of your county could have information about your ancestors if that was the newspaper that they used. So I tried to find all the cities nearby and put them all into my guide and put the years. Luckily, the newspaper directory at Chronicling America does include the years, so I just copied and pasted that. And then I try to make a note about which ones are digitized and which ones are not, because if I know that it's digitized, I'm going to be more likely to search that first in my research plan, rather than if it hasn't been digitized, then I'll have to order the microfilm and be pretty sure that there's something in there that I want. So that helps to kind of guide your research planning if you know more about the newspaper.
That's a great point. And I would say that kind of goes for your vital records as well, that section, that you can have a note about when registration started, because you're not going to look for a birth certificate in many of our states about 1800 because they simply were not kept. So if you know when the state started registration for birth, marriages, and deaths, it's going to help you to know what to put in your plan, to know if something would even be available. So I think that's a great point, that in these, especially if you're doing a county guide, you're going very specific, you can make yourself some notes about when things were available and what records would be available for different time periods.
All right. Well, now that we've talked about how our locality guide template works and what's in it, let's go over some of the questions from Debbie and some other questions. So for example, here's one question that I had. If you're doing a client research project or you just don't have a lot of time to create a big locality guide, you're not going to spend hours, what are the most important parts of the template to fill out? Like if you could only spend 1 hour or less, what do you really need to know about the locality before you can research?
This happens to me all the time when I'm doing client projects because I might get a project, it's a 20-hour project, and it maybe includes 2 or 3 counties, and I may not have a locality guide done for those counties. And I could do one of two things. I could, on my own time, not the client's time, spend 10 hours doing a locality guide for that county, or I could just spend 1 hour doing a very quick but thorough guide for what I think I will need for that project. And I typically go with the second option because my time is limited. And so what I will do is I will do a quick link to the FamilySearch Catalog collection for the county. I will do a link to the FamilySearch Wiki for that county, and I will copy and paste in the table of record availability because for every county on the FamilySearch Wiki, they have a little table there, and it tells you when all the records are available from for the basic records. And then I'll make quick notes of boundary changes. I'll study the map a little bit to understand if I am looking the right counties for the right time. And then I will maybe put a couple maps so that I have a really clear visual of what the county was like at the time period I'm studying. So if my client project is, say, based about 1850, then of course I wouldn't need to worry about putting in links to records that were just for the 1900s or for the 1700s. So that's what I do when I don't have much time. I just try to focus on the pieces that will help me for that current project. I have basic things and then maybe just a few other little things that will help me for that specific project.
Great. Another question that Debbie had was, she was saying that how do you keep track of where you have looked? Because each website has more links to other pages that could be helpful. And then she gets clicking on those links to more links. And then she gets lost and forgets where she's already been. So what do you think? How could you keep track of where you've already been?
The very first part of the guide where we have the links to the major record collections, I like to just include those right there, the major record collections. And I don't go off on all the side links or the sublinks because you can go to, for instance, the ancestry collection for Alabama, and then you can drill down within that. So I don't necessarily go off on and try to include every link, on every single website in my guide.
That makes sense because, if we have the main link, then we'll see the other ones when we get there. And if we need them, then we'll be able to click on them. It's good to think of the locality guide not as like a book, but more as a list of resources, that you can click on and you can use those resources in more depth. Okay, what about how can you kind of prioritize the most important information? And how do you know what would be the most helpful to your project to put in your locality guide?
Well, again, kind of take a look at the time period you're researching. For instance, I have English ancestors who came over about 1850, 1860 to the United States. So I would start with the record collections that would be in the 1800s and kind of prioritizing that time period. I wouldn't include in my locality guide at this point, because English records can go way back into the 1600s. At this point, I would prioritize and not worry about those yet. I would try to put in links to things that would be helpful for what I'm researching.
That's a good point that, we might be using this locality guide in the future, but for now, we're just using it for a specific objective. So if you are limited on time, you can focus your locality guide to just include those record groups that are applicable to your time period. And then if you want to use it again later and you're using it for a different time period, you can update it.
Right. That kind of leads us into the next question. How do you know when you're finished? And of course, we know that our locality guides should really never be called finished because there will always be new record collections coming up, new things that are digitized, new things that we've discovered, new articles that have been written that we want to include. So I would just say start with the basics, get the basic information in there, and then set yourself a time limit. How much time do you have to really work on this guide realistically? Do you have an hour like sometimes I do, for a client project? Or do you have ancestors that lived in New York from, the very beginning of New York till now, and you want to do a very inclusive guide and you want to do 20 hours on it? That's going to be a personal decision about how much time you have and how much time you want to commit to it. But I would say give yourself a time limit and say, okay, I'm going to do everything I can within this amount of time, and then realize that I can go back and add to it as I want to.
Yeah, that's really helpful to say, I'm going to be finished after 10 hours. instead of saying, well, how much information before it's finished? Because like we said, you could go on forever and ever adding more information. And when you finally get to the point where there's nothing else to add, then you can publish that as a book. There's so much to learn about each locality. And I think that's why I love this part of the research process so much, is because when I learn about the locality, I feel so much more empowered to go find applicable records that are going to solve the question and solve the problem that I've been having. And often when I learn about the boundary changes, I realize that there's like 3 other counties I need to be looking in for records. And that's kind of what's happening right now with Hawkins County. I'm realizing that there were several other counties that I need to check. And that could be why I haven't been able to find anything prior to this project. So I'm excited for the discoveries I'm going to make in Hawkins County and the surrounding counties coming up soon.
Right. And I just want to kind of end with the idea that doing something is better than doing nothing. So if you're looking at the template or you're thinking of doing a locality guide and you're just so overwhelmed thinking, I don't even know how to get started, set your timer, do my productivity tip of setting the timer for 25 minutes and just get started. Just take one of those sections and start clicking around, start adding some record links, look at the FamilySearch Wiki, and then give yourself a break. Come back and do it for another 25 minutes. Just get started. And often we can overcome all of our obstacles by just doing something and not procrastinating something that we think is going to be too hard to do.
Yeah, just getting started on it. And like our friend Sherry said, she didn't really want to do this assignment in the first study group or second, whatever it was. And then as she got started making it, she just couldn't stop because she was having so much fun. And so I think that's kind of what happens too, that like after you start working on it and you get a little bit, you want to keep updating and making it better because you see the value of it and see how much you're learning and you get into it. So just try it out.
There's really so much benefit from doing your own work because there are published guides, these type of things that are published out there that you can purchase and that you can use. But there's something about discovering things yourself and doing your own exploration of a record set and then putting it together in a guide that's just for you, that you understand, that makes it more usable.
Well, that was a fun episode. I hope you all listening can improve on your locality guides from something that you heard here today and that you'll make some progress in your research.
Yes, good luck with creating a locality guide if you have never done one before. And if you have done one, then maybe you can go back and add a little bit to it. So have fun, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.